And what are we doing today? Today we are doing sentence correction, parallelism, as I wrote you about earlier, reading comprehension, focusing on a short passage, and finally, equations, inequalities, and VICs. To change things up a little bit today, I'm going to be doing the verbal, and Emily's going to come back after the break and do the math. So jumping right on into parallelism. Let me switch over the polling to A through E and pop a problem up. Very first thing, you have an OG problem to do. Here it is. You've got 2 minutes. Go ahead. Okay, I lied. Actually, I want you to take 1:30 on each of these, and I didn't pop a timer up separately on the screen. I was keeping it on a stopwatch with me. So, got some answers split between B and E. So, I'd like to call on somebody to talk about his or her answer. Let's see. Brooks, would you jump on the mic and tell us why you picked your answer? Actually, let me jump back on. Brooks, type to me if you have a working mic. Should have checked that beforehand. No. Let me ask for volunteers. I'll go ahead and kick it out to everybody. You know, it's sort of hard to get warming up so fast. Okay, Ryan, jump on.
This looked like basic parallelism. The verb was to approve, so you have to pick to enforce its, which is E.
So why are you, well, obviously we're talking about parallelism here, so you are maybe primed to think of it, but how do we know that to approve is the thing that we have to be parallel with in the underlined portion?
You can get rid of the prepositional phrases to try to isolate the verbs.
Sure, so you can get rid of some things like for controlling, the discharge, etc. Yeah, Catherine, jump on.
I think another helpful word is either, which is right before to approve, so you know that there's got to be something else besides just to approve.
So what goes with either, or you say either, I say either, what goes with that?
Either or. I don't know if you can do either. I think it's only neither nor, either or, I think.
That's exactly right. Either goes with or, and neither or neither goes with nor. So the word either always requires the or when it's followed by something like this. And so the explanations we've heard here are exactly right on. And you can strip out a whole bunch of the other stuff that's in between. So we have either to approve, and then what must follow the or should also be a verb form like to approve, similar in form. So we've got to enforce, which is called an infinitive, which is parallel in form to the to approve up here. So that alone gets you to the right answer, which is E. In fact, as you're reading, you might sort of mentally be doing something like this. the Environmental Protection Agency is required either, and that should sort of be priming you to look for something, to approve, blah, 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 and you're kind of waiting for this or. And these two things here, either and or, are what we call parallel markers. They're like little flags that tell you that what follows them must be parallel. Now, we don't have to have every single thing that comes in this whole phrase, as Ryan pointed out. Not everything in here winds up being parallel to stuff down here. But the beginnings of what follows a parallel marker must be parallel to the beginnings of what follows the other parallel marker. So obviously we aren't going to draw these diagrams in real life, but I want these parallel markers to kind of flash for you. And then you can say, oh, I need to approve to go with to enforce, and that's why. So the basic principle of parallelism is that when you have those markers, those comparable sentence elements that follow those markers should be parallel, which really means two things. One is they have to be structurally similar, and they should be also logically comparable. In other words, we should have them both be infinitives like to approve or to enforce, and we should be able to somehow compare them logically. So give me smiley faces or confused faces on this one, or a thumbs down if you say, no, that makes no sense whatsoever. Yes, Jean-Laurent. Oh, no worries. Okay. So, smiling face on that one. Next problem. Let's give it a shot. Here you go. I'll clear your polls. Oh, whoops. I just realized I had a couple of slides. Common parallel markers so you can be spotting them. Peas and carrots. Peas, carrots, and beans. So we see that and is a very common parallel marker. Sometimes we have it preceded by a both. Sometimes we don't. One that we saw in this previous problem was either X or Y. And then, if you think of the song Conjunction Junction, if any of you know that song, it talks about and, but, and or gets you pretty far. And those are three conjunctions that make things around them parallel. But we also have things that aren't conjunctions, such as from to. And then is a conjunction, but it's a special kind of conjunction that sets up a comparison. And really, anything that creates a place for two things that we're comparing or sort of putting in a list can create parallelism. Yeah, Emily knows what I'm talking about. Conjunction, junction, what's your function? So all of y'all, as part of your homework, you've got to look that up on YouTube. Common parallel elements, the story of this slide is it really can be anything you want. Nouns, from sorrow to joy. Verbs, that are the main verbs of a sentence, either worked all day or slept all night. You can have infinitives, as we just saw. You can have these things called participles, which are ing forms acting to modify other parts of the sentence, such as the rain fell. What did it do while it fell? Or what were some of the results of it falling? Well, providing water but flooding streets. You can also have whole phrases, and notice here, into the well rather than over the wall, don't have the same preposition, but they both tell us where we jumped or didn't jump. You could also have modified nouns or even whole clauses. I've noticed that you howl and that he cowers. So those are some common parallel elements. So now I've got the problem for you. Here we go. You've got a minute and a half. Go. Okay, that's a minute 30. Go ahead and put in your answer if you haven't already. Okay, we've got a split, and that split is between A and C, which I like to see because it means that you picked up on the parallelism that's going on in this sentence. And so everybody picked up on this point, which is we read that the Ojibwa society did what? Well, the first thing it did, or the first thing in the list, is organized its labor, provided access to its resources, and something else. So everybody agreed on that. And so I'll just go ahead and say one of the things that you should always be on the lookout for with lists is and. When you see two things that might form part of a list, realize that that list is never going to be poetic. They never say on the GMAT, he was tall, dark, handsome. They always say he was tall, dark, and handsome. Likewise, they never say he was tall and dark and handsome and wonderful and just amazing. They never put lots and lots of ands all at the same level. They'll always be very standard in business English. So it's X, comma, Y, comma, and Z. Now, looks like there's been some change of heart on the part of the C's, and indeed, the correct answer here is A. So we have organized, provided, and defined. All these other ones, B, D, and E, break the parallelism, the list that we expect organized, provided. And then why A? Let me go ahead and ask, why A versus C? What's the difference? Raise your hand. Yeah, Danielle.
C is wrong because we're talking about the distribution and consumption of resources, not of the tribe, and resources are plural. So it would be like there or those, not it.
Great point. So its distribution and consumption would be talking about the distribution and consumption of a single thing. Razi, you had your hand up. Go ahead and jump on if you had other thoughts.
Well, the other thing is that when you read C, it says undefined rights and obligations as they were involved in its distribution and consumption. The they is a little ambiguous because it's in this sentence you can infer that it's referring to the tribe, but it actually could also refer to the rights and obligations that were involved in the distribution and consumption, which is not the case in the sentence.
Brilliant. That's exactly right. So both of these issues, the fact that it is not referring to the right thing, it seems to be the wrong number, and this they is vague, are pronoun issues. These words they and its are pronouns, and we're going to discuss pronouns in a later session. But realize, hey, they're going to come up in problems about parallelism. Most sentence correction problems deal with multiple issues, and so I'm really glad to see that you all are ahead of the game. So we have to go with A, and notice that we refer to the resources by literally saying, again, the word those resources. That gets rid of any ambiguity. So excellent. The most important parallelism marker is and so look for lists. Whenever you see an and, it should be glowing on your screen mentally. And you should always be saying to yourself, what's in the list? Is it a 2-thing list? Is it a 3-thing list? Is it even a 4-thing list? We've seen those on the GMAT. In fact, you're going to see them soon. They will always use these commas as well in multiple item lists. Don't leave out that last item. Finally, if you're ever confused about what should be in the list, feel free to rotate the list. And what I mean by that is to move the last item first. So can you say the Ojibwa Society defined? Yes. So you can always check the parallelism of a list in that way. All right, let's move on to the next problem. You have 1.5 minutes. Go ahead. That's just under 1:30. Amit, would you jump on the mic and talk us through your thought process?
Yeah, sure. Can you hear me now? Okay. We have to look at I marked option E because there we see a parallel structure between leading and prompting, and to lead to is not the appropriate use. That's what I feel. And again, between more delay and increase, I selected increase as a better option.
Okay, fantastic. So to recap, we have and all over the place here, so you should be thinking what's being connected by and. Here we have to lead and prompts. That's not good. And we have to lead and prompted in D. That's not good. In C, we have to lead and prompt, which is parallel. But when you put an infinitive at the end of a sentence like this, you mean intention. In other words, if you say, the surge has clogged the system to lead to something, then you mean that the surge intended to cause that. So, we blocked traffic to cause panic. That means we meant to do it. In fact, you don't even know whether it happened or not. You don't know whether or not there was panic. But that's why we did it. That's obviously not what's intended here. So we're left with leading and prompting. Notice that the ing form at the end of a sentence, when it's modifying the main verb, indicates not intention but outcome. We blocked traffic causing panic. That means panic actually happened. In fact, we might not have meant to. We blocked traffic in order to have a party, but that caused panic. Then we'd say we blocked traffic causing panic. So that's one thing to just use as a quick test between to lead and leading. And now the difference between B and E has to do with more delay versus increase in delays. And because the original sense is we're counting delays, 55% more delays means if there were 100 at the beginning, there were 155 later on. Whereas 55% more delay would somehow mean delay is some stuff, just time, and we're somehow measuring out more of it. And that doesn't really sound right. Changes the meaning. You could say 55% more delays, but they don't give us that option in the correct answer choice. The answer is E. Give me a smiley face if you're ready to go on to see the next problem. Great. Let me just make a quick point about this. The reason we put this in here is because not every verb is parallel. We have has clogged, and then we have leading, and we have prompting. Let's look at another example of a similar sentence. Ken traveled around the world, visiting historic sites, eating native foods, and learning about new cultures. Give me a smiley face if you think this is correct, or a thumbs down if you think that the parallelism should be improved. All right, we have some early adopters. Indeed, it's just like the problem you just did. We have, he traveled around the world. And what did he do while he was traveling around the world? He was visiting, he was eating, he was learning. Those three things need to be parallel to each other, but not to the main verb. So make sure that everything is logically parallel before you try to make them all structurally parallel. Emily's got a great example in the chat window. Traveled around the world to study other cultures, in order to study other cultures. So that was his intent. Here we know that he did these things along the way, but they are subordinate. So be careful around verbs. Make sure that they really are intended to be parallel before you force them into parallel structures. Okay, next problem. Try this one out. We've got a minute and a half. All right, take shots. Got most of the answers in. Okay, almost everybody's responded at this point. Brooks, let's go back to you. Jump on the mic down at the bottom left and talk through what you spotted first and why you picked your answer.
Can you hear me this time? All right, good. Well, I guess the first thing I looked at is I saw the from was one of those markers, and I saw the two. I picked answer C, and the thing that attracted me to C was that from the from to the to is almost identical, and from after the to the end of the sentence, all you have to do is switch water and air and landfills and incinerators, and so it seems extremely parallel to me.
Fantastic. So we've got, you can't get more parallel than the same exact words. So we've got from X to Y. Notice they're kind of evil. They put the from outside, but they're never going to have the same exact word in front of all 5 answer choices. That's not GMAT-like. So they won't underline it if it's the same in all answer choices. So notice that parallel marker you have to be able to spot outside. In fact, sometimes good oratory uses this same kind of parallel structure. Maybe you can hear some mayor saying, from the pollution of water by landfills to the pollution of air by incinerators. Everything lines up nice and neatly. I'll show you the diagram. That's not so neat. So what we do want is from the pollution to the pollution of water, of air, by landfills, by incinerators. And think of good oratory again. So ask not what your country can do for you, but what you can do for your country. Or government of the people, what is it? For the people, by the people, from the people. shall not perish from the earth. All those kinds of famous speeches use parallelism. So let's take a look at a pretty tough one now. Go ahead and give this one a try. Again, 1.5 minutes. All right, take a shot. Okay, I'd like you to take your laser pointer. I haven't played with this in a little while. Remember, it looks like this little shiny wand over at the upper left, a few tools down. I'd like you to take your laser pointer and point on the slide to the parallelism marker that you spotted. Where's the parallelism marker in this sentence? Yeah. I'm seeing a whole bunch of lasers like flies circle around. I'll be the arrow. Circling around and buzzing the and there. As we saw before, and is our most important parallelism marker. So now what I'd like you to do is move your laser pointer. I'll mark and. Move your laser pointer to the first item in the list created by and. First item in the list created by and. And remember, we don't know whose laser pointer is what. So we've had some on the onset of ice ages, and we have some moving around the reversals. Somebody for the onset. Talk about that. Raise your hand. Who wants to defend the onset versus reversals? Or is it not going to happen? No one's fessing up because we've seen where the crowd is going. Go ahead, Amit. Yep.
The theory basically talks about impacts of asteroids and comets which impacted the Earth's magnetic field, and basically as a result of that we had ice ages, the continents splitting apart, and then great volcanic eruptions. So that's what I think.
So let me see if I can play that back. So you're saying that what happened is that the impacts caused these reversals in the Earth's magnetic field, which then led to or caused the onset of the ice ages, the splitting apart the continents, and the eruptions. Someone on the other side of that, go ahead and raise your hand. Who thinks that the first item in the list is reversals? Put their laser pointer up there. Yeah, Brooks.
Okay, so I put reversals up, and I thought that there was a parallelism between reversals and eruptions and the onset and the splitting apart.
All right, I'm going to cut to the chase. Between Brooks and me right now, Brooks is right. And that's because 4 things were caused, all in parallel to each other. What we would need, Amit, for your point is some inform between the Earth's magnetic field and the onset of ice ages. For instance, may have caused reversals in the Earth's magnetic field, causing the onset of ice ages, da-da-da-da-da. But there are really 4 things in this list. We've got reversals, we've got the onset, we've got whatever we've got underlined, and we've got eruptions. Let me show that to you in one of these diagrams again. And go ahead and type into the chat window so that we can see it. Type into the chat window, what part of speech is reversals? In other words, is it a noun? Is it a verb? Is it an adjective? And how would you know? I haven't spent a lot of time on terms like that, but is it a noun? Is it a verb? And I'm getting both kinds of answers. I'm getting nouns, I'm getting verbs, I'm getting other things, adverbs, adjectives. And here's the idea. A noun, as they say, is a person, place, or thing. In fact, there's a glossary in the back of your sentence correction guide that you can refer to on these things called parts of speech. Words like noun, verb, etc. A noun is something you can put the in front of often. So the reversals, in fact, is a noun, because you can say the reversals. Can't do that in front of every noun, like Chris is a noun, but Chris can also be the subject of a sentence. Can I say that these reversals are terrible? Yes, indeed. So technically, reversal is a noun. Likewise, the onset, we've got the in front of it. We're sort of talking about it as a thing. And eruption is a noun. Whenever you can pluralize something and say there's more than one of them, then that means it's a noun. But why is there something verb-like about these? What makes them verb-like? Well, because they're actions. They somehow are made from actions, from verbs, such as reverse. I'm not sure what onset comes out of, but eruption comes from the verb to erupt. So there's something about this which seems like an action, it is an action, and it seems like a verb in noun clothing. It really is a noun because we would use it as a noun. The reversals, these reversals are terrible, but it comes from an activity, from an underlying kind of verb. So this thing here also needs to be an action. It comes from a verb, split apart, but it needs to be made into a noun and dressed up as an action. And the problem with ing by itself, although it can be used as a noun, such as running is fun, swimming is great, in a list of action nouns, ing by itself often doesn't work, because you could confuse it with something else. You could confuse it with these participles I talked about before. We're modifying something else. No, we want to talk about the activity of splitting apart these continents. So the correct answer for this one is indeed B, the splitting apart of continents. It sounds like the changing of the guards. Kind of pompous. But the GMAT loves this form in a list of action nouns. This is talked about in the advanced part of the parallelism material in our guide. So it's actually in a chapter sort of towards the end that includes some of that advanced material. It's not in the main parallelism chapter. But we talk about this idea of action nouns such as reversals and eruptions, and the GMAT liking this the and putting of afterwards if you've got objects after this action. So questions? All right. So, oops, I'm getting a question on what's wrong with C, D, and E. Yes, we've got nouns. In fact, we've got nouns in all these things. So one point about all of these is, yes, there are nouns, and these are nouns too. However, the noun we want to be the third item in the list has got to be the activity, not the continents themselves. You can also try rotating the list to the front. So put that green part right up here in position 1. Would you say that the impacts may have caused splitting apart continents? No. You would say the impacts may have caused the splitting apart of continents in the same way as they may have caused the reversals or the onset or the eruptions. So these other ones you're not causing split apart continents. You're not causing continents split apart or continents that were split apart. You're causing this activity, the splitting apart of continents. So to wrap up here, I'm going to do one more problem after this, a really heavy-duty problem, throw you some really, really tough stuff with parallelism. But just to review what we've said, comparable sentence elements need to be parallel logically and structurally. Those are some of your favorite forms. And remember, X and Y, the actual elements can be all kinds of different things. Okay, so let me jump here to a pretty advanced problem. Here it is. Oops, not this one. Sorry. Jumping ahead. This one. Yes. We've got 1 minute and 45 seconds for this one. Go ahead. All right, that's 2 minutes. Go ahead and put something in. This one's pretty tough. By the way, let me go ahead and point out, when we write down here something like D46, what that means is that it's part of the diagnostic test in the official guide. So there's a diagnostic test, if you haven't already encountered it in doing official guide problems, that's at the beginning of the official guide, and it contains some great problems separate from the sets that are throughout the main part of the book. So I've got a split between A, C, and D, and some partisans on all sides of it. And let's build this one up point by point. Researchers have found that individuals who have been blind from birth and who thus have never seen anyone gesture. Let me pause here. What we see is that we've got this structure inside here and making these two clauses parallel to each other. But notice we still haven't finished out what individuals are doing. Well, what do? They nevertheless make hand motions when speaking. Speaking how? Just as frequently and in virtually the same way as sighted people do. Notice what we've got here is as frequently in virtually the same way, and then the as doesn't have to be repeated for both. It can kind of function across both. As sighted people do, and that they will gesture even when conversing with another blind person. So what we've got going on are 3 different little parallel structures, and a couple of them are inside others. Is this correct? Researchers have found that individuals do something and that they will gesture. What do we find out of which individuals who have been blind from birth and who thus have never seen anyone gesture? And when do they speak? Just as frequently and in virtually the same way. In fact, this is the right answer for those of you who picked A. So a couple of layers. One is, notice that because these two parts are so far away from each other and there are some interior lists with this and here and this and over here, they'll put a comma here. And that's just to give you a pause, a breather between this first big item and the second big item. And notice only A and B make that parallelism correct. With this second bit of parallelism, we only see that that is correct in A, B, and C. Finally, just as frequently and in virtually the same way, is not correct in B and in D, because we need to say just as frequently, not just as frequent. Now this is a very, very difficult problem. Go back to this one in the book and take a look at this one. One of the ways they make sentence correction difficult is by just putting a lot of text up there. So be sure to keep it straight. Now, getting a question in, Brooks has a great point. Wait a second, we're jumping all around in tense. We're saying researchers have found, and tense is time. So have been blind from birth. So that's what's called present perfect. It started in the past and continues to now. Thus have never seen anyone gesture. Now they make hand motions, or in general they do. And that they will gesture. And that's future. But we're allowed to change the tenses as long as the sense of the sentence allows it, and in fact requires it. We are going to jump around in time here. We will get to verb tense in session 7, and we'll see that, yeah, you don't want to change horses, change tenses in the middle of a stream for no reason at all. But when forced to, it's okay. So back to our point of main verbs being parallel. Main verbs can be parallel, but not necessarily the same tense. It's okay if these structures contain somewhat different tenses. So with that, let's move on to reading comprehension. And then we'll take a break after this. So first of all, I'm going to switch the polling so that you're on the check and the X. So carry out these steps and put a green check when you're done. The reason we're doing this is to be able to fit a reading comprehension passage on the screen. Looks like I've got almost everyone. View should be on default. And tools, whiteboard, uncheck the scale to window option. Okay, so Emily, if you could follow up with the one or two folks who have not done that, we'll keep rolling forward here. So let's talk about the reading comprehension spectrum. And this is really an approach to reading comprehension that we have to sort of think about how we're going to read. And one way you could read is to be a bookworm. Some of you may indeed be. I am a bookworm by nature in my real life. On the GMAT, what a bookworm does is give a really careful first read. I'm going to pay attention to detail. And why? Because they might ask me about it. I'm going to go ahead and put you on public chat again and ask you to type in any pros or cons of these of the bookworm approach? Pros and cons, just type into everybody. What's good about being a bookworm? What's bad? And label it, like good, bad, that sort of thing. Yep, I'm seeing cons, not enough time. You could be spending too much time. And Catherine notes the lost in the details. Yeah, by definition, these things get pretty detailed. So yeah, the pro is that you comprehend the whole thing, but I'm even going to put a question mark next to that because you could get lost in the details if you're trying to get every single detail and master the entire thing. And in real life, many of us need to be bookworms in our jobs. And so realize this is a time test. You've got to read a little bit more quickly than this because these things will stress you out. In fact, you know that you're taking too much time if you're paying too much attention to all the details, and that in and of itself distracts you. On the opposite end of the spectrum, we've got the hunters. And what the hunters do is say, screw the first read. I'm just going to look at the question and then go try to find the answer. Well, type in some pros and cons of that approach. Go ahead and type some things in. Pros and cons of the hunters. That's interesting, Chris. You wrote faster with quotes. Come on the mic if your mic's working. I'm not sure it is, but go ahead and come on the mic and explain why you wrote that.
I just think you might feel like it's faster because you're just going for the answer, but then I would guess, at least when I've done this in the past, you go back multiple times looking back and forth, and I think it probably wastes more time than it actually saves.
I'm with you there. Yes, it's speedy if you happen to be able to find that right answer, but if they're asking you even the main point of the whole thing, you don't really know. And you could wind up being way too slow in questions. So notice how these are kind of opposite ends of a spectrum of approach. And so the magic place, of course, is the middle ground, which is kind of hard to strike because you can easily get sucked into one end or the other. What is this approach? You're going to do a balanced first read, and you're going to pay attention to the structure of the passage. Balanced first read means you read it slowly at the start, trying to make sure that you get the main point of what this is about. And as you get further in, put it more to psychic arm's length. Our Chapter 1 talks some about this in the Reading Comprehension book. And we talk about some principles of reading a reading comprehension passage. And yes, you need to engage psychologically with the material, but you also have to be ready to speed up as you go along. Because what we want you to do is feel well-paced. We want you to get a structural sense where things are, not get lost in the details. So, of course, we didn't put any cons down for that, right? Because it's perfect. It's hard to do. So that's part of what we're going to practice today. That's what this is all about. So what are the characteristics of short passages? Well, a couple of paragraphs, they fit on the screen usually. Fewer than 50 lines, the word count on them is around 250, between 200 and 250. 3 questions on average. And we recommend a time of 6 minutes, not just for the passage, but total. In other words, you're going to take 6 minutes to read and to understand the passage and to answer those 3 questions. Even though they're short, there's still a lot of detail, as we'll see. So what you've got to do is do some kind of note-taking. And our note-taking approach for short passages is called the headline list. What does it do? It helps you focus. Remember, you're going to be in the midst of a long exam. Your brain's a little fried. How do you focus? Well, by taking some notes, as we talked about with critical reasoning. Those notes are going to be structural and pretty light on detail because you want to emphasize the structure. And that first reading needs to be both fast and productive. You can't afford to just throw away that first reading, but it needs to be quick enough. So how do you do a headline list? Here's how. If on the left side we have what you see on your screen, don't worry about what this actually says. This is the passage on the screen. What you're going to jot down on your paper is a headline for each passage, each paragraph, I'm sorry. And that headline is something about the first and second sentence. Pretty bulleted. Then any key points in here that you feel are really important, bullet them down. But be ready to leave them out. I'm of the opinion that if you leave out entirely, in many cases, the stuff, especially in later paragraphs, in the second or the third paragraph, then you're sometimes better off. So you're going to have to find your balance of how much to put down. And again, use the structure of the actual material to help you structure what you put down. Much as you did with critical reasoning diagramming, you're going to need to abbreviate. You need to do arrows, cause and effect, and then attribute, say through using colons or just put the name of the person, whatever you want, whatever your note-taking procedures have been in your life. But let me make this really key point. Do not try to get everything down from here. Why? Because you still have the passage on the screen when you are answering questions. So you should not be copying it all down verbatim. You're not going to answer the questions from the headline list itself for the most part. Really, the creation of it is using it. By writing something down and being organized about it and abbreviated, you'll be better off once you get into the questions. So the passage we're going to do is in a second, and the find the point slide, I just realized is here. What's the point? The main idea that the author wants to convey is the point. And sometimes that's the first sentence or two. Sometimes it's somewhere else in here. And amazingly enough, it's often an explicit sentence somewhere in the passage. So it's actually, more often than not, somehow written out. And this main idea is the author saying to you, if I want you to remember just one thing, this is what it is. It's kind of like the critical reasoning conclusion. And it's often a resolution of some problem. It could be an answer to a question. It could be a new idea versus an old idea. Or it even could be a reason for some weird phenomenon. So sometimes there'll be some setup. And we talk about this in actually Chapter 2 of our Reading Comprehension Guide, where we talk about the point and then the other components of the passage, which could be background, just sheer background material. It could be actual support for the point, trying to prove the point. And then implications are sometimes there. It's usually not as opinionated as a conclusion of a critical reasoning argument, but it shares the idea that it's the main thing this author wants to say to you. And so what we'd like you to do is, on your headline list, you've probably got the point somewhere. It's often here, or it's often here, or it might be the last sentence or something like that, and it would leap out at you. So make sure that on your headline list you've got it noted down. So now let's go to the passage, which is from the 11th edition, and here it is on the screen. I'm going to give you 3 minutes to diagram it out. Go ahead. All right, that's 3 minutes. Might have felt pretty fast, and you might not be done. If you're not done, you might have written down too much. But we'll look at an example of this, of the headline list in a second. What I'd like you to do in the meantime is type into the direct message window privately. We've set it so you're just sending it to us. Type into the direct message window an abbreviated version of the point. In other words, which sentence or sentences in here contain the main idea that the author wants to convey. Take a minute, locate the point, and type it into the direct message window. Fantastic. You're saying the first sentence, which is indeed the point of this particular passage. Now, no one who typed in wrote exactly this. You're always going to have your own style. That's fine. Now, how much you wrote down afterwards about what happened in 1840, society was made up of farmers and somehow male-dominated, and census measured the economic activity of households, not individuals. How much you put down about that stuff, if at all, is going to be a matter of taste and choice. On the actual GMAT, and certainly in practice exams, you should practice taking these kinds of notes so that they're at your beck and call. You can do them, you can use them, you can make them. But in real life, sometimes you're going to be pretty drawn back and maybe not take as many notes as we've shown up here. That's fine. Second paragraph, pretty similar. And what we find for short paragraphs, or short passages, I'm sorry, is that the two paragraphs are pretty balanced most of the time. That doesn't mean that they aren't related to each other, and often this second one is a little easier for you to comprehend because you've read the first one, so you might not have to write down as much about the second paragraph. But in terms of the importance, sometimes the second paragraph is just as important as the first one. And again, the point marked up here. So now, how do we use this? General questions that ask you what's the main idea or something, you should know it because you created the headline list. And worst case, you could actually look back at your headline list. What you don't want to do so much is reread the whole dang passage because you're going to have to read the whole thing. So really try to answer a general question without going too much back to the passage. In fact, the way I think about generals is A, B, C, D, E. You should be able to dive in. Just having read the passage and having done a headline list, you should be able to slash out 1, 2, maybe even 3 of these on the fly, like, that's not related. And then go back and test every word on B and D. Getting a great question on the board, which is taking notes. By stopping and taking notes, you could get distracted from reading. Let me just jump back. This is pretty complicated stuff, and you've got to stay focused on it. How much do you read before you take notes? What I'd recommend is trying it both ways. At the most, go a whole paragraph and then take some notes on it. But I ask you to try right now, over the next week and 2 weeks, as we do reading comprehension, to stop really after each sentence, especially early on in that first paragraph, and take just a little bit of notes on each thing, then come back. Because it's little bite-sized pieces. It's going to feel a little bit unnatural, but if you can do that, it winds up becoming easier, as opposed to reading a whole big long thing and then you're trying to go back and figure out what was this again and so forth. So I'd like you to try doing it like eating an elephant, that is one bite at a time. Then you take fewer notes as you go on, especially as we'll see next week in long passages, so that you might read more and more before you take a new note, because you're fitting all these pieces into an overall thought, an overall framework that's led by the point. Again, which is not necessarily the first thing. Ganesh, great point. You're having to read on the screen, then jump down to your paper and then back up. This got a lot harder when it moved from paper to the computer. I think reading comp of all the question types sort of jumped the most in difficulty. And that's because it's hard to read on computer. I like to print things out. You got to scroll when it's a longer passage. You can't see all the questions at once. This got a lot harder. But that's the reality, and we're dealing with it. So one way to do it is to take this set of notes, which you didn't have to do so much when it was on paper because you could mark up the passage. Now I was talking about general versus other types of questions. General questions ask you about the main point or the tone of the overall thing. Those will tend to be easier, and what I recommend is that you take 45 seconds to a minute on those and just dive right into the answer choices. You can get rid of probably 3 of the lies, and then among the other answer choices, you should prove or justify every word. When you are studying B versus D, make sure that you can justify every word. Now, what do you do for specific questions? Those are harder, because what you have to do is stop what you're doing right at the question and do not dive into the answer choices because you're not yet an expert. Those lies will seduce you. By definition, you didn't become an expert on every detail. So what you need to do is go back to the passage and search for keywords based on the question and find proof in the passage. Be sure then not to add anything to that as you bring it back to the answer choices. So I'm going to just type here XXXXXX, question mark, and then you've got your answer choices A, B, C, let's make that C, D, and E. And what you'll notice in the question are some keywords around the details. That's what makes it a specific question. Those keywords, say around where the wasp brings the grasshopper, leads you to where to look in the passage. Go back and get solid on that truth. And only once you're solid on the truth, come back and then start slashing out answers. In fact, what I find on complicated questions is sometimes I have to take new notes in order to master these couple of details I happen to get asked about. So for specific questions, feel free to go a little bit over a minute, say a minute and 15 seconds. And you stole that from the 45-second general question. So before we actually dive into any questions that you have on the difference between general and specific. Let me go ahead and make it public so you can ask sort of generally. Percentages for general versus specific. Typically you're going to have 1 general and 2 specific questions per short passage of 3 questions. So these tend to be a little bit easier. These tend to be a little bit harder. You get more of these, and that's sort of the deal. Should you read the first question before you read the passage? That's a matter of taste Emily, I'd love to hear your point of view on this. I find that I can't get distracted by it. It's sometimes, in fact, it often is a general question, but it is sometimes a specific question. And I find that I get distracted by reading that first question. I have enough trouble focusing on what the passage is about, and what I don't want to do with a specific question is get all distorted about what the main idea of the thing is. So, but some people swear by it, and so I'm sort of agnostic. I think you should try it. If it doesn't work for you, go away from it. I'd love to hear your point of view on that, Emily.
Yeah, I was trying to type and I inadvertently inserted a frowny face. That should be a comment about the general to specific question ratio. It does seem like I haven't paid attention to it specifically, but it always seems to me like the general question comes first. I think that's deliberate on their part because they don't give you much to go on. I'm not sure if that's different from what you were saying because I was typing, but I don't recall ever seeing more than 2 general questions in a certain passage, and it's usually only one.
It's consistent, and actually I should tell you because I'm the guy behind the algorithm on our own CAT exams, our computer adaptive tests, and you'll sometimes get a specific question first. In fact, it happens quite often. We didn't program ours to force a general question first, but it seems like the GMAT does, maybe not force it, but it seems to be what we observe. A good question from Ryan about if you have 2 specific and 1 general, why do this headline list? What's the value of diagramming? Really, it's back to this point about the RC spectrum. How do you achieve this balanced first read, right? If you do the hunter thing, thinking, oh, I've got 2 specifics in here, why don't I just go hunt for the answer? The problem is you don't really understand the point, and you can be easily trapped by little reversals in the text because you don't get the complexity of the theme. So I think a first read before going into the questions is critical. It's the truth. But that has to be a relatively fast first read, and so that's where the technique of diagramming and making this sample headline list is useful. I don't think this should slow you down very much from your reading, but you have to practice it. So realize it's going to diminish your performance in the short run because you're going to be taking notes when before you weren't taking notes. And that'll slow you down a little bit at the start. But as you practice this, you'll get faster at it, and then you'll realize, oh, wow, I can do so much more when I have really understood the passage first. And it's a focusing technique. So I'm a big believer in taking notes in an organized way. Amit, on your question, would all the 3 questions come in a sequence? You don't see all 3 at once, you see just 1 at a time. So you have to answer the first of the questions and then answer the next. So let's give this a try. I know I'm going to have to wait and see what you do for homework. Let's give the first question a try, and it happens to be a general. So I'm going to give you 45. I'll give you a minute because you'll need to refresh a little bit on the passage, which would be normal. So you've got a minute. Go ahead. Okay, so take a shot. even if you're not comfortable. And let me show you the answers you all picked. You all picked C, so either everybody's wrong or everybody's right. Those 2 out of 13 who didn't do anything were Emily and I. So why not A? Let me ask someone. Angela, would you jump on the mic and say why you didn't like A?
Well, I didn't see any free thinking in the reading.
Fantastic. If they just simply said explain the methods used by early statisticians, that might be acceptable. But that and critique part, so make sure that you test all the words. I hope you found that you were able to go through on this one, having done some note-taking, and knock out some of the irrelevant answers pretty quickly. Now you might say, well, I would have done that anyway if I just read the thing. But remember, this is also part of a process. So you can get better at this note-taking strategy. Let's do a couple more, and then we'll take a break. Here is your next question, which is a specific question, so I'm going to give you a minute and 15 seconds. Go ahead. Okay, that's a minute, and I got 18 there. Put in your answers. Okay. So you haven't I talked in a while. Ganesh, jump on and talk about how you approached this problem and what your answer was. This looks like your audio wasn't working there. Let's give it one more try. Okay, sorry about that. Seems like the mic isn't working. Let's get Andrew. You want to jump on and talk about how you approach this problem?
My notes look fairly similar to yours in that through my note-taking, I had highlighted many of the years that these changes took place. And so for many of these answers that have years in them, it's very easy to say, yes, this did happen, yes, this did not. Well, yes, it did for the most case. And so the only part where I couldn't find anything specific that they had said was C.
Yeah, this is kind of a pain. These except questions are just evil because you know 4 of them are not lies, 4 of them are truth. So there's no good way through these except just brute forcing it. You got to go find the truth 4 times, and then the one you can't find is the right answer. It's the lie. The one little trick I'd say on this is that when you have an except, start from the bottom. Half the time I forget to do that, but it would be rare that the very first answer choice would be the right answer because you wouldn't be able to find that one. They want you to waste some time looking and finding things that you can find. Did anyone find C? Raise your hand if you want to contest Andrew on this and if you found C. Yeah, Razi, go ahead.
answer C, it says year in which the overlap between women employed outside the home and women keeping house was first calculated. And then if you look at the last sentence in the second paragraph, it says overlap between the two groups was not calculated until 1890, which indicates that that's when it started.
Yeah, unfortunately, that is correct. So that, yeah, and Andrew, you're probably saying, thanks, Chris. You had me taking my notes, and because I was taking the notes, you know, I missed that last one. So it is a difficulty, and having the notes like we did does make it easier to find things. But remember to always go back to the passage itself to do the actual verification. And so, Razi, which one didn't you find? What was your answer?
Mine was D, because it says the way in which 1890 census measured women's income levels and education backgrounds. Even though they said that in 1890 was when the census measured women's income level and education backgrounds, it didn't really specify the way in which it was done.
Yep, and unfortunately, unfortunately for those of you who picked other answers, Razi, you're correct. Fortunately for you. So there's no fun way through them. You just gotta plow through them, and for one like this, it's going to take some more time. So Emily's got a great point. When you glance up and down, numbers and dates jump out. They do stand out in text in English, and so be sure to use those as those signposts. I also tend to use a diagramming technique that actually puts a sort of timeline up, 1850 across the top, 1870 next to it, 1890 next to it, that sort of thing. That's how I think of dates, so I don't necessarily list them down the same way. Let's do one more, and then we'll take a break. All right, this is a pretty tough one. Let's get some answers in. Do I take a shot? All right, I'm going to go ahead and publish answers. And what we see, let me move this, is we've got a split between B, D, and E, and no one's going for A or C as of yet, and a couple folks still to respond. So this one's pretty tough, as seen by the split in the answer choices. And so from the points we made on the last question, 1840 U.S. Census, we skim up and down using Emily's technique, and we see through 1840. And we reread this stuff, perhaps through the end of that first paragraph. And we try to make sense of it all. So let's see. Let me call on someone and say, defend your answer a little bit. So Catherine, jump on the mic and talk about your answer.
So when I skimmed the answer, or was reading the answers, or I skimmed the passage, it was really focused on the main, the head of household who is presumed male or absent. And then the last sentence focused on, like farms, most enterprises were family run. And then I also focused on the words home-based agricultural economy. So when I went through the answers, it didn't focus on women at that point because that's something that the passage is overall explaining, that women were counted later in that 19th century. People engaged in non-farming occupations. This one focused more on farming, not non-farming occupations. People engaged in social movements, that didn't come up. Women engaged in family-run enterprises, again, women weren't really even counted at this point. So I went with E, men engaged in agriculture.
Okay, so what I've done is highlight a little bit so we can keep track of the thinking there. Someone who went for B said, wait a second, non-farming occupations, I'm still going for that. Why? Someone who liked B, defend. Go ahead, raise your hand. Think about why. Yeah, Andrew, jump on.
I chose B because of terms such as hierarchical social order. So I was thinking that the typical social order of that time period would have, yes, the male would be the dominant one, and then everybody else sort of did other things. But I also looked at persons counted in various categories, including occupational categories. So that again alluded to other non-farming occupations. And so those are really my two things that I looked at together.
Ganesh, jump on.
Yes, hello. Another thing that I noticed was that the head of a household was presumed male or absent, and it never mentioned how many males were engaged in a job. It just said that, so basically if you're trying to count the number of men involved in agriculture, you can basically say
Looks like we lost your audio there just at the end. But to pick up where you, I think, were going, in order to count the number of men engaged in agriculture, you'd have to know the sex or gender of these folks, because only the head of household was actually counted either as male or as no one, and so had a gender attached. In fact, later on it tells us that not until 1870 was occupational information analyzed by gender. So in fact, all that we could ever get is a count of people in 1840. And although there is this hierarchical social order, that doesn't tell us about people engaged in social movements. It actually counts people in various categories, including occupational categories, and so therefore gives us non-farming occupations as well. In fact, the answer is B. This one is a lovely question, and it's so brilliant on the part of the GMAT, because we all do. In fact, I got this one wrong when I first did this, and then I remembered, oh, I'm going to never get this one wrong. I went for men engaged in agriculture because, Catherine, I did it just like you. I read through this, and I caught these words, and I had this image of what was going on, and then I thought, yeah, hey, they're focused on a male order back then. They're focused on an agricultural order back then. So men engaged in agriculture accords with this. But notice, what I failed to do was to very closely see it's a count of which of the following. So it's not what they focused on or cared about or something, it's what were they able to count. And they were only able to count people in occupational categories and maybe other categories. Notice they throw us by using the term non-farming occupations, which is not excluded from this. So this is what I call sort of false irrelevance. They're putting up some little obstacle to you to make you think, oh, isn't that they were focused on farming back then, so of course they wouldn't have this count of people engaged in non-farming occupations, but in fact they would. So this is a great question to grow on, a great one to learn how they can put all kinds of little obstacles in your way and to really use the proof. Emily's put it excellently in the window. Don't just go on the basis of your sort of vague impression and memory. Actually go back and say, okay, in 1840, which could I count? And make sure you can prove it. So what I've highlighted here from Andrew's comments in yellow, the simple enumeration provides total number of persons counted in various categories. That's for the others besides the head of household, but it's close enough that it gets us to B. So any questions on this one? This is a fantastic question. Great one to study. And to get this one, although it's from the 11th edition, you can of course watch the recording again. So, any other commentary or questions? All right, let's take a 5-minute break, and when we come back, we'll get started with EIDs. Thanks. Yep, go ahead and test your audio. I'm assuming you went through the audio setup.
Hi, Chris. Can you hear me? All right, let's come on back from break. So Andrew, Brooks, if you guys are back, click on that blue door and let us know you're here. But we're going to get into what is an old topic for many of you. You last saw this perhaps back in
junior high or high school with algebra. We're going to focus on 3 types of algebra problems this week. We will revisit algebra next week when we talk about data sufficiency specifically. So, what's on tap today? Equations. We're lumping into that all different kinds of equations, linear equations, those with absolute value, and exponents. The most common type with exponents is an exponent of 2, as you find in a quadratic equation. These crop up all over the GMAT. Inequalities show up with all of these different types of equations. So the big difference between an equation and an inequality is simply the sign. Instead of an equal sign, you have an inequality. And then there's this third type of problem we're going to see tonight, which is what we call VICs, variables in the answer choices, where our unknowns show up not only in the question but in the choices themselves. So there are 3 principles that correspond to those types that we're going to focus on today, because the GMAT writers build questions around these principles. First is that when you see an even exponent, watch out, because those often have more than one solution. Not every time, but a lot of the time, enough of the time. Second thing is, when inequalities are involved, there's this extra layer of complexity, because you have to remember that although you can do a lot of the same manipulations that you do with equations, you have to remember to flip the sign if you multiply or divide by a negative number. Okay, you don't have to worry about that with an equality, of course. And with VICS problems, there's 3 different ways to approach them, some of which are likely to be new to you, and you may even be resistant to the other methods. So we're going to talk about all 3 of them, when to use each, and why to use each. So let's get into it with the even exponent stuff. Here's a couple ways that you can see these. First thing is, if you have an exponent of 2, you should anticipate 2 solutions. Okay? Or at least be aware that 2 solutions can exist. There's a little caveat that I've written here. There can be fewer than 2 solutions, but there'll never be more. Basically, the rule of thumb is your highest exponent tells you how many maximum number of solutions there might be. And I think you might see it best with this first example, the basic equations. You guys can tell probably by looking at this that there's 2 solutions. You can either square 9 or square negative 9. And either way, you're going to get 81, because when you square a negative, the negative signs cancel. Now, I'll give you a quick example of one that sort of breaks that general rule. If I had x squared equals 0, even though there's an even exponent of 2 there, there's really only one solution. It's only going to be x equals 0 that you can square to get 0. Quadratic equations have the same deal, but of course those you factor. So the key to factoring is that you have to have 0 on one side. The reason the 0 is so important is that what we're going to do with the expression on the other side of the equal sign is put it into product form. This times this. We're going to play on that number properties rule that says that 0 times anything gives you 0. What that means is that whether this first set of parentheses is 0 or this other one is 0, we would have 0 as a result. And that's why we have 2 solutions come out of this. Either negative 4 makes this first one 0, or positive 2 makes this second one 0. And it's because of 2 minus 2 gives you 0 that we see an opposite sign for our solution from what's in the factoring. Okay. The sneakiest way that they can give you a quadratic is in disguised form. As we see down here, there's no exponent in this as given, but if you clean it up a little bit, a quadratic quickly emerges. So you multiply both sides by x to kill that fraction. It's already starting to look more like a quadratic. Of course, to solve for a quadratic, you want to get 0 on one side, so when we move that 36 over, there's the quadratic that was hidden. I'm going to ask you a preliminary question here based on this stuff in data sufficiency form. Try this question down below. coming up on 2 minutes, so try to wrap it up. Okay, last call for answers on this one. And I've got to tell you, so far so good. You guys are unanimous so far, and you got the correct answer, those who have an answer in. Let's complete the math. I got you guys part of the way here. This should look familiar to you. Statement 1 is the x equals 9 or negative 9 solution that we did up above. But of course this is in data sufficiency context, so if x is 9, the answer to the question, is x 9, is yes, right? But if it's negative 9, the answer is no. And it's that discrepancy between a possible yes and a possible no that makes statement 1 insufficient. And so you guys are rightly avoiding A and D there. Statement 2 is like our disguised quadratic. If we take this a step further, it factors this way, x minus 9 times x plus 4, which gives you 2 solutions. And what's relevant about those 2 solutions in this yes-no question is that one of them is 9, but the other one is not. If it had given us 2 solutions and neither one was 9, well then this would have been sufficient, but here we have a yes and a no, and so this is insufficient as well. So the key to this problem, and sort of my ulterior motive in asking this, is a data sufficiency point. When we put these two together, what can x be? What is the solution for x? Go ahead and type it in. Is it 9, negative 9, and negative 4? Now, Razi, why is it only 9?
Typing it actually. So the question is x equal 9? With the first equation that we're given is x squared equals 81. It could be 9 or negative 9. And if you try and sub in, and that doesn't give us like basically what, it doesn't answer the question. So if we go to the next one, again we're given 2 solutions, which is 9 or negative 4. But what we're trying to find is one solution that would answer the question whether x equals 9 or not. And in this scenario, there's only 9 that fits both solutions. So the answer would be, both statements alone are not sufficient, but together they are, because they allow us to answer the question whether x equals 9 or not.
Yeah, the key to this is on data sufficiency. A lot of the time when you combine the 2 statements, you've already done all the work you need to do. And what you need to remember is that only the solution that is on both lists, only the solution in both statements is going to work when you put the statements together. So together, our only solution is in fact 9. Another way to look at that is that while negative 4 is a solution to this second equation, it's obviously not a solution to this first one. Negative 4 squared is 16, not 81. And so the only one that plugs into both and works is 9. And there is our definite yes, and the answer is in fact C. Good. So takeaway there is look for overlap in your solutions on an algebra problem like that. I'm going to give you a full 2 minutes on this one. Go ahead and enter your answers when you've got them. Okay, last call for answers. And Catherine, can I get you on the mic? Would you get us started on this? What do we do with this equation?
I took x less 1 equals the square root of 400. You want me to keep going or not? And then, and I actually kept the x less 1 equals the square root of 400, which is 20 or negative 20. And then you could do it either way, where x equals 21 or x equals negative 21. And then I plug that into the equation x minus 5, and say negative 21 less 5 is negative 26.
Yeah, Catherine has got the concept here, which is she remembered the thing that is really important, the positive and negative solution. And very intelligently solved for both of them. You don't want to lose sight because they're both valid solutions. Where you got nabbed, though, Catherine, is here. When you adjusted for negative 1, the negative 1, or added back basically to isolate x, you went the wrong way. And this is a very common error. The GMAT writers know that this happens. So there is an answer choice that reflects this. I think what is going on with this, it's a little bit like, have you ever tried reading in a mirror? It's doable, but it requires a lot more brain power than just reading the normal way. And you know, adding and subtracting in the negative side of the number line is a little bit like that, right? You sort of go the opposite way of what you normally do. Yeah, and so that I think is what accounted for it. But actually, if we complete the math with the negative 19, you would have gotten the right answer. X minus 5 is actually negative 24. The number that you picked was off by 2, so there's that trap answer for you. And the other solution, by the way, positive solution, is 16. Did anybody do this one a different way? Just curious. All right, Ganesh, you're suggesting something. Don't solve for x. What do you mean by that?
The question is asking whether what's the value of x minus 5. So you're given the equation x minus 1 equals 20. You can simply subtract 4 to get x minus 5 directly instead of finding out what x is and then subtracting 5 again.
Okay, so you're sort of suggesting, why add 1 and then subtract 5 when you can do it in one step and just subtract 4? I think that's a good point. A bigger time saver might even be just to recognize what Catherine did. The negative solution is important, right? And if people forget any solution, it's going to be that particular solution. So if you're going to cut corners anywhere, maybe don't do this solution, the positive one at all, and actually do all of your work on the negative side, because it's more likely to be the one that is listed up there. Let me ask you guys this, especially those of you who had answer choices rolling in late. Anybody do this initially and actually multiply it out? Smiley face if so. So John Laurent is indicating on the side, yep, I did that. Anybody get anywhere? Yeah, Razi's saying the same thing. But I did it out, he's saying, and guess what? I ended up with like a 399 in the equation. And he says, that sucked. I agree. At least it's not prime. At least it's divisible by 3. And by the way, this is factorable. But it would be a bear to factor this. The actual factorization is this. X plus 19. I don't think I would see that personally. So how, what's the recognition skill? Go ahead and just type it in the box here. For next time, what will tell you, don't do this, do what Catherine did. And Chris is beating me to the punch here. He's typed it in. If there's a perfect square here and a perfect square here, go with that. Take the square root of both sides. It's going to be a better method than actually doing this method, which doesn't take advantage of that. All right. Let's do this one next. All right, I've been keeping the time on my own stopwatch. We're around 2 minutes, so go ahead and put your answer in, please. Hey, Chris, you had kind of an early answer entry here, and you are correct. So what did you do to get this done quickly? I'm going to guess that you didn't multiply this out the long way, like foil after foil after foil. Remember, foil is first, outer, inner, last. What was your insight, Chris?
Yeah, I just saw that there's basically 2 pairs with the first 2 going together, then the third and fourth going together, and the O and the I of foil on each of them cancels each other out, and so you're left with 2 minus 1 times 3 minus 1, which is 2. Hey.
That's a great way to put it. The O and the I, the outer and the inner pairs of factors in those partners have opposite signs. Yeah, that's a great recognition skill. The fact that you're seeing those terms repeated but with that sign difference. Fantastic. That's what we call a special product, because this is actually a special form that you want to be prepared to recognize and exploit. So here that is. As Chris pointed out, if that radical 2 times 1 term cancels out, all we're left with, the O and the I cancel out, we're left with the F and the L in FOIL, the first and the last terms. So that's where they're getting that radical 2 squared minus 1 squared. And the other set is basically the same thing. And that's kind of nice because all of the radical signs drop out right there. Square that 2 and or radical 2 and you get a 2. And so the end result is just the number 2. So this is a purely computational problem if you don't see the form of this or the special product within it, and that probably accounts for the relatively high number it's assigned in the official guide, but it's a great example of a problem where recognition skills can make your life a lot easier, and it turns the problem into something significantly easier. And so that you'll be prepared to recognize these in the future. Here are the three common special products that show up. This is the one we just saw, and it's probably the most common of the three. Chris, I don't know if you'd agree with this. This is the GMAT writer's favorite, it seems. The other two are similar to one another. I think the thing that's most relevant about those is that they're identical except for the sign of that middle term. So if you see these in combination and you add them, that middle term would cancel out. But knowing that these have a form that you know, sort of prescribed can be helpful. And here are some examples of ways the GMAT will sneak these in on you. Hidden versions, perhaps. Here's the difference of two squares, where the square is not just a square, it's a square of a square. So if you actually put it in this form, there's another difference of a square that pops out of that. So x squared minus y squared, 1 squared, we're back to this, this format, and that part would factor down. Let me circle that. So that part in green is giving you those two. And here's one. The common terms that should pop out at you are the pair of 2's and the x's. They're not in the same order, but you know what? You can put them in the same order, and when you do, you'll see this more as one of those common forms. All right, let's try one more on equations before we move to inequalities. All right, let's call for answers. Just missing a couple. And if you're stuck, let us know. Go ahead and make a guess. Anyway, and text away if you're stuck. I'll be sure to address where you're stuck. But here's what we've got, a split between A, C, and E. And from this I'm going to deduce that everybody thinks statement 2 is insufficient. So let's start there. I'll basically bring us up to the point where we start to disagree. Statement 2 is in fact insufficient, and it's the perfect statement to start with. All it tells you is that x is not equal to -2. It doesn't address whether it's 1 or some other number. So this is insufficient. It's also the easier statement since you don't have to do any manipulation with it. Okay, so we're eliminating B and D quite confidently. Brooks, would you grab the mic and talk about what you did with statement 1?
Well, what I did is I moved the 2x over to the left side of the equal sign. I factored out the x and got an x times x plus 2 times x minus 1 equals 0. And I couldn't remember what the x outside the equal sign or outside the parentheses meant, if it was a 1 or a 0, but I was thinking it was a 1. So I put it equals 1 and -2.
Okay, so you said you pulled the x out, and it was this x that you listed as x equals 1. Is that what I'm understanding, or did you do another step after this? Okay, so you got a solution from there. What was your solution from this part of it? Brooks? What does x equal to here?
From that part, it was 1 and negative 2. It was you had a multiplication of, or you had x plus 2 times x minus 1.
All right, perfect factoring. And you actually, would have had the right answer if it weren't for the thing that you questioned about this x over here. What we're dealing with is just the product of 3 things. So we're going to use that same rule about product that has 0 times anything gives you 0. So one way you'd get a 0 is if you plug in a 1 here. Another way you'd get a 0 is if you plug in a negative 2 over here. But you'd also get a 0 if x is 0 itself. So yeah, if x equals 0 is what this x represents. So everybody smiley face for me if that makes sense. But perfect manipulation, basically, up to that point. Chris did not do something that occasionally people will do. And that is, instead of pulling the x out, they just, drop the whole thing off entirely. They say, oh, I can just divide this whole thing through by x. Of course, if you do that, all you're left with is negative 2 and 1 as a solution. Why is that a bad thing to do? Why can't we just drop the x? Amit, what do you think?
We don't know the sign associated with x. It could be positive or negative.
You're close but not quite there. Sign will matter on inequalities, but when it comes to equal signs, we don't care about negatives. What we do care about is 0. And you don't want to divide by x because, yeah, 0 might be a solution, right? If x is 0, we're doing something illegal if you divide by x. And you'd only want to do that if you're explicitly told that x is not 0. And in fact, as Ganesh is pointing out on this side here, if you did, and Danielle too, if you drop that x or pull it out or divide by it, you lose that 0 solution. And Danielle's making a great point that that makes a huge difference for data sufficiency here. Because when we combine our 2 statements, okay, 1 and 2 together actually give us 0 and 1. They're still on our list because statement 1 done correctly gives us 3 solutions. Statement 2 only knocks one of them out. So here are the 2 remaining. And this is insufficient because the answer for 0 is no, and the answer for 1 is yes. But if we had lost that 0 solution, we would be thinking at this point that we have a definite yes. And so C is a trap answer for that reason. Okay, the correct answer in this case is E. But a lot of you guys went with A as a solution, so I want to inspect why that happened. What happened there, do you think? I'd love to get a volunteer on that. So my question was, let's look back at our answer distribution in this class. We had 2 people going with A, and actually there were other A's in there that got switched at the last moment. My question is basically, what's up with that? What makes someone say, okay, 1 tells me the answer? getting some good suggestions here. One is that maybe there's potential confusion between value and yes, no. Usually that manifests itself with someone thinking that a statement is not sufficient when it is. For example, we might have a yes answer or a definite no answer to this question, even though there are multiple solutions. But I don't think it explains it in this case, because these folks were saying, oh, one is sufficient, even though it isn't, the opposite type of error. I think one thing that I've seen that's led to A, and somebody was texting about it earlier with Chris, is kind of the plug and chug approach. And it kind of goes like this. Well, let's check one. We'll plug it in to this equation. And that does give you 1 plus 1 equals 2. So you might write this on your paper and go, yeah, it works. What's wrong with this? Raise your hand if you can tell me what am I doing wrong? This is mathematically correct, right? Danielle, you've got it. Just because this solution works doesn't mean there aren't others. Yeah, it's a very dangerous thing. You don't want to mistake this question, which is basically, must x be 1 or is it definitely 1, for the more wishy-washy, could x be 1? We don't care whether x could be 1, we care whether it is. Yeah, great. Danielle's echoing that with the can. Yeah, because it can also be something else, right? As you are pointing out, it could be 0 to the third plus 0 to the second, of course, gives you 0. So there's another example of a solution. And that's why on an algebra problem, it's usually best to do the algebra. Hunting and pecking for the answer can lead you to logic mistakes. At the very least, if you're going to do this method, look at it strategically and say, there's an exponent of 3 here, which means I might be able to find 3 solutions. So don't stop at the first one that you plug in. So very, very nicely done with that, Danielle. Good diagnosis. And are we good on this one? Give me a smiley face, because we're about to move on to a different topic. If you are clear on this one. Great. All right, our next topic is inequalities. We'll start this one with a problem. All right, try to get your answer in and guess if you need to. All right, what I'm going to do is change the polling so that it goes privately to the moderators. What I'm interested in on this one is how confident are you in your answer? They rolled in kind of late, so I'm really curious. Rate yourself as confident, very confident, somewhat confident, whatever applies. I'm getting only a smattering of somewhat confident responses. Chris was most precise with a 63% confidence rating. Andrew, you are the only person who said very confident. So let me get you on the mic, and maybe you can give us your insight on this one.
Just trying to redo it just to make sure I'm not wrong. But the first one of the solutions I looked at was 2 because it had less variables. And so doing the basic algebra, you get x plus y is less than -1. Therefore, to make the question true, z would have to be greater than 1 because it would have to be greater than 1 to get above 0. For statement 1, I guess the first thing I didn't really look at it that much, but I'd do z minus 1 is greater than x plus y. However, I don't know if x or y is negative or if they're both negative, so z could be 0 minus 1, which could be greater than a -4 minus a minus 8, which could be the variables for x and y.
All right, I'm going to stop you because I'm not keeping up with you on the page, but I think you've given us something really interesting to look at, or several interesting things. I love this observation that 2 is easier because it has only 2 variables instead of 3. And what you did with it, I thought, was really neat, how you isolated those 2 variables, kept them together because they're together in the constraint we have. And so you basically looked at 2 in light of the constraint that we already have by plugging it in. If x plus y is less than 1, and this whole thing has to be greater than 0, well, that sort of implies what z needs to be to make up the difference. It's got to be greater than 1. Yeah, that's kind of a neat way to do it, so you're sort of balancing it out. And let's hear from the class on this one. Did you guys follow that part of Andrew's assessment? Give a smile if that part of it made sense to you. And notice that I'm using this notation LP for less than -1. Makes shorthand and plugging imprecise numbers a little bit easier. Yeah, so that definitely answers the question, and you can cross out A, C, and E confidently. Here's where we were as a group. Notice that if you guys had just that insight on that particular statement, none of you guys would have gone with C and E. I think it's very natural to go with C and E on problems like this. They're the choices that seem to be safest when you don't know what to do with the math, or if you get stuck somewhere. But sometimes there are trap answers, so starting with the easy statement and doing as much as you can with that one can sometimes prevent that type of error. Now, I kind of was losing track of statement 1 when you were talking about it, and in fact, when I did this problem on my own, I didn't quite know what to do with statement 1. It's very difficult to see how this one relates. There is a better method here, and this is what I want to talk about. So we'll kind of skip over statement 2 for the moment until I give you this method. Step away from it for a moment and think about a family. And in this family, there's a mom and a dad, and the mom is Donna, and she's shorter than her husband, Jorge. And there's a little kid and a bigger kid, and the little kid is shorter than the older kid. Now, imagine that they go out somewhere, and each parent is going to put the children up on their shoulders to see the parade or something. If Donna's got the little kid on her shoulders, and Jorge has the bigger kid on his shoulders, it's pretty clear to see, or it's pretty, I hope it's intuitive to see why Donna and the little kid combined would still be shorter than Jorge and the older kid. Because you've got the 2 tall people, you know, one tall person holding the other taller person up, and the shorter parent with the shorter child. Does this make sense to folks? Now let me ask you this. What if it were, intuitively yes, what if it were like Donna and the older kid, and taller Jorge was carrying the shorter kid, the little kid? Which set is taller then? So several people are saying, I'm not sure, you wouldn't be able to tell, you don't know. Rosie, would you grab the mic and tell me why, you're not only telling me you're not sure about the answer, but you're basically saying you shouldn't be sure about it. There's no way you'd be able to tell. Why not?
We know that Donna's height is less than Jorge's, but we don't know by how much. Again, we know, and also in the same scenario, we have the little kid's height being less than the older kid's height. Again, we don't know by how much. I mean, Donna could be 2 inches shorter than Jorge. The little kid might be, 5 inches shorter than the older kid. So the difference between Donna's height and Jorge's height is much less than the difference between the little kid's height and the older kid's height. So if it's, sorry, I lost my train of thought, but I think you know where I was going with it. But yeah.
Yeah, you're exactly right. When we pair the taller adult with the shorter child, and the shorter adult with the taller child, suddenly the differences in heights between the parents and the kids become relevant because maybe they cancel out. I was actually inspired with this example by my own family. My husband's significantly taller than me. He's like 9 inches taller than me, and that's approximately the difference in our son's heights. And it occurred to me that I could hold the big one up, he could hold the little one up, and we would basically be, the boys would be looking eye to eye. Yeah, so there's basically no guarantees unless the inequality signs are facing the same way. This we can be sure about. Donna and the little kid are shorter than Jorge and the older kid. So the takeaway here is that when it comes to an inequality, as long as the signs are in the same direction, you can add. But all bets are off when the signs are in opposite directions. We don't want to add Donna and the older kid because basically to do that we would have the sign flipped in this one. It'd be opposite. If you're willing to go with me on that, give me a smiley face and let us know if there's any uncertainty on that. We'll see how it plays out on this particular. Yeah, and don't subtract inequalities because again, it's a place where the differences become relevant. Now, what does that mean here? We've got an inequality as our constraint and an inequality in each statement. What we can do is line those inequalities up and add. So, let's do statement 2 first again. Here is the question stem inequality. Here is the one from the statement. We've just turned it around so that those inequalities are going the same way. And when we add, we get something we know is bigger over here, something we know is smaller, and we can cancel. So the x and the y drop out of both sides of that, and we end up with z is greater than 1. This is sort of like what Andrew did. He's plugging in for x, y, and canceling it that way. In his solution, here they just drop out algebraically. For statement 1, do the same thing. But this time, when we add, we are able to cancel the x and the y from both sides, but we're still left with 2z is greater than 1, which mathematically works out to z is greater than 1/2. Now, there's your uncertainty. When we're told that z is greater than 1 with statement 2, that's sufficient. But these greater than negative or greater than 0.5 is insufficient because there are some values that are over 1 and some that aren't. For example, z could be 0.75 or it could be 75. And the answer to this one is B. All right, but that's not all we're going to do on inequalities. We are going to do a few more problems, so we'll practice this a little bit more. All right, last call for answers. And Danielle, you switched answers there at the last second, and you did so correctly. So why don't you talk about your approach?
Okay, I started with, well, first, I perhaps incorrectly rephrased the question. I made it into is r squared less than, s squared is r less than s, because we know that both r and s are positive, which made it easier for me to do statement 2, which is what I started with. And since s and r are positive and s equals r plus 4, then yes, r must be less than s, so that's sufficient. So I knocked out ACE. Then I simplified statement 1 to be r equals 3s over 4. And just for a brief second, I thought, okay, I don't know, we can't tell. But then I realized, well, I can get that into the original format by dividing by s, so r over s is 3/4, which means s over r is 4/3, and 3/4 is less than 4/3. But even, I think, if I hadn't done that, r equals 3/4 times s, and since s is positive, 3/4 times any positive number is going to be bigger than that positive number, so it's D.
Yeah, and the only time you expressed any kind of uncertainty here was when you were sort of going through these final steps. And in fact, there are several ways to approach this. What was fantastic about what you did was the rephrase and your justification for the rephrase. You need to clean this question up because it is kind of in a weird form. It's tough to know what's going on with fractions, especially with multiple variables and multiple fractions. And what you said about the fact that r and s are positive is really important here, because if we're going to do this manipulation where we cross multiply, we need to know that those are positive, because otherwise we would have to worry about whether to flip the sign or not. By being told this constraint, they basically tell us, don't worry about that. Don't worry about flipping the sign. And so you're free to do that cross multiplication. And it's also what allows us to take the square root and realize that, okay, since r and s are positive to begin with, the square of r is only going to be less than the square of s, as you said, if r itself is less than s. So is everybody with us on this rephrase? Because that's the key to this one. Give us a smiley face if so. All right, cool. Now from here, the slide shows something that's not necessarily exactly like what Danielle did. Sounds like Danielle, you cross-multiplied a little bit, but you might have done what they did here with the 3/4, together on one side of the equation. What they're basically doing here is substitution. Is R less than S? I could write this above here. Our rephrased question is R less than S, and they're just substituting in the 3/4 S for that R. And so now that's completely in terms of S, and it becomes, is 3/4 of an S less than a whole S? Yeah, if S is positive, it is. And you can even divide by S here because we know it's positive. There's no danger of dividing by a 0 or a negative number. So you can actually get this just in terms of a numerical comparison. That's a definite yes answer, so that's sufficient. Something similar is going on here. They're doing a substitution. Is at R less than S, this time substituting for S, the R plus 4 in for the S. Is R less than 4 more than itself? Yeah, it is. So that's another way to do this. I would possibly on my paper, just the way I think, is if S is equal to R plus 4, I can pretty easily recognize that as something larger than R itself, because adding 4 makes something bigger. So what that boils down to is that S is greater than R. That's another approach there. Yeah, and someone's asking basically to go over statement 1. I'll show you an alternate approach, just in case this way doesn't really click for you. You could do a straight up cross multiplication. And you'd get 4R equals 3S. And solve for R, 3/4 S. I guess they have that up there. And say to yourself, okay, 3/4 S is less than a whole S. And therefore R itself is less than S. So good question, Danielle. This one's number 107 in the data sufficiency set, which is beyond the midpoint. I would say it's a pretty tough question. Definitely high 600s. Chris, I don't know if you would agree with that. Maybe mid 600s. The answer to this one was D. I want to show you a few things about inequalities, things to look out for. And before we do that, though, someone's asking, what if you didn't rephrase? It would be a very difficult question to deal with if you didn't rephrase. You'd be stuck plugging in S and R. You'd basically be doing those substitutions over here, which would basically mean that you're going to do cross multiplication after you substitute and with more complicated expressions. Would you rather cross multiply with this or with, say, an R plus 4 substituted in for S, or this mess substituted in? So would it be doable maybe without rephrasing? Yeah, but it's much easier if you do the work up front and answer the simpler question. Okay. A couple things that we touched on there were the idea of, positives. Knowing that something's positive is really important on some inequality problems. There is a chart in the Word Translations book. This is basically taken from this. So don't worry about taking notes on this. It is in your book on Word Translations page 21, where you'll sometimes see inequality problems in word problem form. When it comes to multiplying by a variable, either to kill a single fraction or to cross multiply and kill fractions on each side, as long as you know those denominators are positive, you're safe. Okay, so that's basically what these constraints are saying. Likewise, going the other way, dividing by a variable that's on both sides, you're safe as long as they come out and tell you that x is equal to 0, or greater than 0. And you can also square and unsquare safely, as long, specifically unsquare when these are positive. The reason this is in the word translation book is that sometimes these constraints will be in hidden form. You will know that a variable is only positive because it refers to the number of people on a committee or something like that. You can't have negative numbers of people. Here's a couple other things that should stand out to you. When you see inequalities that look like this, where there's a 0 on one side of it, what that screams is this problem is about sign, positive versus negative. And that is in fact what they're telling us with these two statements. If you've got a negative product, this is a number properties statement. It's telling you these have to have different signs. And if they have different signs, they're not equal values. So this statement would be sufficient for that question. Likewise, this is telling us positive product, same signs, so the quotient would be positive as well. Okay, so don't worry about plugging in numbers on something like this. It's really more about positive, negative. You can also see this overlap with number properties with fractions. A fraction taken to a power gets smaller, so that's their hidden information with this inequality. And watch out if you aren't specifically told that these denominators are positive. Dangerous to cross-multiply. This might be what this statement is telling you, but it could be the exact opposite. Okay, so the danger there is not knowing. And on a problem like this, you might actually see statement 2 clear up that uncertainty. Maybe statement 2 tells you that xb is positive. And so you might anticipate C as an answer to something like this. Really quickly, just a quick reminder that when it comes to extreme values, a less than or equal to sign means the extreme can actually be that number. Don't make the mistake on a simple inequality where there is no equal bar of thinking that x is 4, and that's the lower extreme. That would be the case if x had to be an integer, but usually they don't specify integers on a problem like this. So it's really like 3.0001 is the lower extreme there. But you can abbreviate or talk about it in word terms with greater than 3 or GT3 to denote that number. Likewise here, lower extreme is exactly -1. Upper extreme is something less than 4. So that's inequalities in a nutshell, mainly warnings and a couple of tips there. I want to move quickly to VIX. And what I've got planned for you here is a speed drill problem. So I'm going to set this up before I actually set you loose on it. Behind this gray box is a problem that I want your fastest answer on. I'm going to set the timer to count up, and I will cut you guys off when 90 to 100% of you have an answer in. So here you go. All right, last call for answers. Stopping that timer. It was at 27 seconds, but I revealed the question at about 4 seconds. So you guys basically took, let's call it 20 seconds on that one. Now what I didn't tell you is that your speed on this one is going to determine how long I give you on the next one. You were awfully fast on that, so I think what I'm going to do is actually give you guys double that time on this one. So let me block out this other one just so it won't be distracting. I'm going to put 40 seconds on the clock here. Pause that for a moment. And here's our next question. All right, last call for answers. I actually gave you guys a couple of extra seconds there because I had it paused inadvertently. All right, I'm going to lock those answers. Here's what we've got on that one. So we're all over the place on this one. 40 seconds is not a long time, but you guys did this one in 20 seconds. And on this first one, you guys went overwhelmingly with A. Just about everybody had it, and that's the correct answer. 1/4 is 25%. Now, what may surprise you is that these problems are exactly the same problem. Right? If x equals 4, then 1 over x is 1/4. Okay? So all I've done is change this from a problem that had numbers in it to a problem that had variables in it. And I think it's fair to say that since I gave you double the amount of time and half as many of you got it right as compared to the original one, that this problem is probably 4 times as difficult, the second one, than the original. Okay, just rough estimate there. And that's basically what VIX are trying to do to you. By putting variables in the answer choice, they add a layer of complexity and they hide the simple issue that would be obvious on a number problem from you. Okay. So basically the way we're going to approach VIX problems is, peel that layer of complexity away. Since numbers are easier to work with, go ahead and run with that. Even if they ask you about what percent is 1 over x, say to yourself, if x is 4, then what answer am I anticipating? 1/4 would be 25%. So when I plug in x equals 4 to the answer choices, the one that results in a 25 should be your answer. So it is A again. So that's what VICs are about. There are 3 ways to do these problems. And here's a simpler example, one that I think you could just do by looking at it and figuring out what the direct algebra should be. If they talk about reading X books per day for Y days and ask about the total number of books, it's fairly straightforward to say, okay, well, what am I going to need to do with those numbers? I'm going to need to multiply them. For one thing, the units will cancel, and I'll get number of books as a result of this because the days will cancel out. So a lot of people are most comfortable with that approach to this type of problem. The second approach is to basically do what I showed you on that percent problem. Pick a number, figure out what answer, numerical answer, that test number would give you, and test the choices using that test number or set of numbers and see which one agrees. So the way that would work on this book example is 2 books per day for 5 days. It stands to reason that's going to be 10 books total. The only answer that gives us the 10 when we plug those numbers in is this one. When you pick numbers, don't pick 1 or 0 because they have unique properties that make them oddball. You don't want to do 0 times anything. It wipes out all the numbers. Pick different numbers so you can keep track of what's what, and pick small numbers just to save yourself time and effort. On a problem like this book one, this method's overkill. But there is a third method, and that is basically a blend between the two. You pick numbers to get your head around the problem, and you use those numbers to kind of figure out what would you do with them. I'm going to multiply the 2 and the 5. That's what makes sense. So therefore, I should multiply the x and the y. Okay? Those are the 3 methods. Let's let you loose on one. This will be our last second to last problem of the night. Last one I'll have you do, and the final one will be a very quick one. Do this one any way you want, but I'm going to keep you to 2 minutes on it. All right, I have 6 answers in from 11 of you. The other half, make a guess or just text to us that you are stuck. And in fact, I want to hear from all of you, which method did you use on this one? If you got stuck, tell us which method you were using when you got stuck. That's relevant here too. All right, Amit, Andrew, Angela, Brooks, I haven't heard from you on your method. Chris as well. Danielle. So far what I'm seeing, those of you who have said number substitution or plugging in values, everyone except for Brooks, who used that method, got the correct answer. And some of you did this algebraically. So I'll show you both solutions. We're over time now, so I don't want to keep you any longer than necessary. Here's the direct algebra method. If you add the two constraints, since they both have an x and a y in them, and the sign on the y's is opposite, when you add them, the y's are going to cancel. So this gives you a formula for x in terms of a and b. So there's one piece of this. If you take those same two constraints, but this time subtract, it's going to be the x's that cancel. So this one gives you an expression for y. And since we're looking for 2xy in terms of a and b, all we need to do is multiply those two things together. And look it, there's that special product that we saw earlier, but this ends up being the answer. So A is correct. Now, I'll tell you, I did this one the first time. This is a very late problem in the book. It's on one of the last pages. It's a tough one. And I got turned around in the algebra here. Started solving for x, but I couldn't get rid of the y. And pretty soon I had circled around back and solved right back to the original equation. I had wasted a bunch of algebra time. On a problem like that, cut your losses and go to a number picking method. Now, I've listed up some numbers here. If you're going to pick numbers, what do you guys think about my set of numbers? Those of you who did pick numbers, would you use these? Let me know. Chris is texting me, they don't add up. Yeah, you bet they don't. X plus y should add up to A, but they give me 7 and A is only 2. Yeah, this is the toughest it gets to pick numbers, and it's not all that bad. You basically have some numbers that are going to be dependent on others. So Chris, what were your numbers? Just real quick, if you want to share them with us, we'll use yours instead. Makes sense to pick X and Y first, right? Because then you basically can compute A and B from them. Go ahead and just give us those. Yeah, 2 and 3. I'm going to suggest that we make X 3 and Y 2. And the only reason for that is that X minus Y gives us B, and I want to avoid negative numbers. A would then be 5, and our target number would simply be 2 times 3 times 2, or 12. So basically from there, all you need to do is plug in A's and B's and see which one of these gives you 12, and it will be answer choice A that does. So that's how the number picking method works, and it's the perfect type of problem to use this on if the algebra is not clear to you. Of course, if the algebra is clear to you, go for it. I have one more thing. I know I'm keeping you late. I just want to show you one quick thing, and it will take 30 seconds, because I'm not going to have you guys do this one. Instead, I want you just to proofread this one right before we go here. There is an error in the solution I'm about to show you, and I'm going to give you 30 seconds to find it. Raise your hand when you see it. All right. Anyone find the answer or the error in this one? Okay, so Andrew's typing something in here. What do you mean didn't flip the sign? All right, Ganesh, you want to get on the mic? Looks like you're raising your hand.
You have to distribute the minus sign in the denominator of the fraction so that the minus 2 becomes a plus 2.
Yeah, excellent. And actually, it helps to put parentheses in here just to see this. This would actually be correct if we had parentheses around this, what was the numerator of that fraction. Because when the k times that fraction happens, you cancel the denominator, but you're left with a minus of everything on the top. And it's the failure to distribute that that led to this particular answer. And as Chris is pointing out, it's deliberate that this answer or this error was baked into this particular choice. I give you 30 seconds to find it, knowing it was there. And you know, maybe some of you were holding out on me, but only 4 people typed it in or said that they identified what the error was. It's going to be even harder to check your own work, and you don't really have 30 seconds on every problem to spend on checking. Plus, if you were this person who did this work, and you got the answer that's up there, you'd probably happily pick A and be like, oh great, it's up there, it must be right. You'd be on your way to the next problem and never even realize that you had gotten it incorrect. Here's the correct answer, C is the right one. So the lesson here is on what seems like a simple algebraic problem. The GMAT writers will bake traps into it. And by picking numbers and actually testing them in the choices, you can beat them at that game because you're less likely to fall for those common mistakes. There are other errors that lead to some of these other choices. It's just too dangerous to rely on algebra alone. And with that, I will let you guys go. Thank you for staying late with us again, but I thought it was important to get to these. Have a good week, and we'll see you next time.
Thanks, everyone. We'll pause the recording here. Andrew, I know you had a question on number 12 from Chapter 12. You can chat about that.